Queen Camilla reportedly told former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson about an assault that occurred on a train when she was a schoolgirl in power and the palace.
In a shocking turn of events that has sent shockwaves through the royal family, Camilla, once celebrated as Queen Consort, now faces the unimaginable. Stripped of her title and demoted to Princess Consort, a scandal of betrayal, ambition, and loss has shattered the monarchy's facade, as the theft of the Welsh gold ring, a symbol of royal heritage, reveals deep fractures within the House of Windsor. The truth behind this audacious act threatens not just the legacy of King Charles,
howled over night after night after night, and that was probably one of my favourites. And then you probably, because you're far too young, we had all these wonderful old-fashioned adventures, wonderful children's stories, and you go on the adventures yourself as a child, Swiss Family Robinson. My sister and brother and I, we always used to.
but the very fabric of the monarchy itself. The news came after months of rumors and murmurs from royal insiders and media outlets alike, all of whom had been closely following the events surrounding the royal household. The change in title was a dramatic move, an action unprecedented in modern royal history. The palace stated that this decision had been made due to an internal crisis of severe magnitude that had rocked the monarchy. In a statement that was as succinct as it was damning, the palace acknowledged that Camilla's role in the scandal had caused significant upheaval within the royal family, damaging the very institution that has been at the heart of Britain's history for centuries. The scandal itself revolved around the theft of a valuable and historically significant artifact, the Welsh gold ring that had been passed down through generations of the royal family. This ring, crafted from the rare Welsh gold mined from the close St. David's mine, had been a symbol of succession, a piece of royal history that tied King Charles III to his ancestors, most notably his grandfather King George VI and his mother, the late Queen Elizabeth II. The ring had always been more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a tangible link to the past, a representation of the legacy and duty that each monarch inherits upon ascending the throne. Confidential sources within the royal household revealed that a series of events, beginning with the sudden and unexplained closure of Balmoral Castle, had set off a chain reaction that would eventually lead to this decision. Balmoral, the beloved Scottish retreat where Queen Elizabeth II spent her final days, had been unexpectedly closed to the public in mid-July, under the pretext of a grave incident concerning royal security. This closure, unusual and uncharacteristic for a period of peak tourist season, raised eyebrows and prompted widespread speculation. With thousands of tourists typically visiting Balmoral during the summer months, the abrupt and secretive nature of the closure was highly unusual. It was not a standard maintenance shutdown or a special royal engagement, but rather a drastic and sudden measure that sent shockwaves through the public. The royal office's brief statement only heightened the mystery, leaving many to wonder about the true nature of the grave incident that had led to the closure. As the media and public began to piece together information, rumors began to swirl. Some suggested a security breach at Balmoral, a notion that seemed almost unthinkable given the strict security measures in place at royal residences. Others speculated that there had been a more personal issue at the heart of the matter, something that had disrupted the otherwise tranquil environment that had long been associated with Balmoral. Behind the scenes at Buckingham Palace, King Charles III was dealing with his own personal challenges. At the age of 75, the weight of the crown, combined with his recent recovery from prostate cancer treatment, had left visible marks on the king's appearance and demeanor. His eyes, often clouded with a mix of sorrow and fatigue, told the story of a monarch who had spent years in the public eye, navigating the trials and tribulations of both personal and royal life. Despite his frailty, King Charles was deeply invested in the events unfolding behind the palace walls. It was in the quiet solitude of his study, amidst the calming aroma of old wood and beeswax, that the king would engage in a personal ritual each morning. He would connect with his ancestors, not through words, but through a physical symbol, the Welsh gold ring. Stored safely in a custom-made vase hidden beneath the paneling of his study, the ring was a cherished piece of royal heritage. For Charles, it was more than just a family heirloom. It was a symbol of his duty, a reminder of the responsibilities he had inherited as king. But when the king reached for the ring that fateful morning, he was met with an empty space. The velvet box, usually housing the ring, was inexplicably devoid of its contents. At first, Charles dismissed the situation, assuming it was a simple mistake, perhaps the result of his exhaustion or a misplaced item. However, as he searched his study more thoroughly, it became clear that the ring was missing. His mind raced, and his heart pounded with an urgency that could not be ignored. This was not a simple case of a lost piece of jewelry. This was a tangible loss that struck at the very core of his identity as king. The Welsh gold ring was not merely a symbol of his position. It was a connection to his family's legacy, a representation of his mother's reign, and a tangible reminder of the responsibilities he now shouldered. In a state of growing panic, Charles immediately called his head of security and ordered a full investigation. Elite security personnel combed through Buckingham Palace, questioning staff and scouring every corner of the palace in search of the missing ring. But despite their efforts, no trace of the precious artifact was found. The once serene environment of the palace had been disrupted, and the mood shifted from one of royal grace to one of uncertainty and fear. The king's poise, already fragile due to the ongoing challenges in his personal life, began to crack under the weight of this crisis. In a moment of intense frustration, he struck his fist on his desk, the sound echoing through the walls of his study. "Locate it," he bellowed to his security detail. "Find it at any cost. This is my legacy. This is my mother's inheritance." At this point, the investigation began to take a darker turn. The missing ring was not just an issue of lost property. It had become a symbol of something much deeper, something more personal. The mystery of its disappearance began to point to a much more troubling possibility, that the ring had been taken deliberately. The question on everyone's mind was, who would want to steal the king's ring, and why? As the investigation continued, rumors began to surface that pointed to one person in particular, Camilla, the woman who had once been the king's consort and who now found herself caught in a scandal that threatened not only her relationship with Charles, but also the stability of the monarchy itself. The quiet whispers of betrayal that had once been confined to private corners of the palace now started to grow louder, and the public, sensing that something was amiss, began to pay closer attention. The British monarchy, a symbol of stability and tradition for generations, now found itself at the center of a crisis that threatened its very existence. The king, isolated in his grief and confusion, was left to confront the possibility that the person he trusted most had betrayed him in the most profound way imaginable. The theft of the Welsh gold ring was not just a personal betrayal. It was an act that symbolized a deeper fracture within the royal family, one that would take years, if not decades, to heal. As Buckingham Palace prepared to address the situation, it was clear that this scandal would forever alter the course of the monarchy. The loss of the Welsh gold ring, coupled with the revelations about Camilla's involvement, would mark the beginning of a new chapter for the royal family, one that would be defined by suspicion, betrayal, and a profound loss of trust. The situation surrounding the disappearance of the Welsh gold ring escalated quickly, moving from a quiet mystery within the confines of Buckingham Palace to a scandal that would eventually capture the attention of the entire nation. King Charles III, having been confronted with the shocking realization that his prized ring had vanished, was thrown into a state of confusion, frustration, and growing suspicion. As the investigation into the theft intensified, the king's trust in those around him began to erode, and a sense of unease took hold of the royal household. Although the king's reaction to the loss of the ring was one of sheer panic, the public, perhaps unsurprisingly, remained largely unaware of the true gravity of the situation. However, inside the royal palace, a different story was unfolding. Behind the elegant walls of Buckingham Palace, an air of uncertainty began to permeate the corridors, as whispers of betrayal and suspicion started to grow louder among those who had access to the inner workings of the royal family. While the king's immediate response was one of disbelief, hoping that the ring might eventually turn up, the situation became increasingly difficult to ignore. As the hours passed, the investigation deepened, and more details began to emerge that pointed towards a calculated, deliberate act of theft. This was not simply a case of an item going missing. Something far more sinister was at play, and it seemed increasingly likely that the person responsible for this breach of trust was someone very close to the king. Despite the turmoil within Buckingham Palace, Camilla, who had once held the title of Queen Consort, maintained a composed public image. In the midst of growing whispers and escalating tension, she made an appearance at a charity engagement in London, where she appeared calm, collected, and seemingly unaffected by the chaos unfolding behind the palace walls. Dressed in a sophisticated pale blue ensemble, she greeted volunteers, posed for pictures, and exchanged pleasantries with members of the public. To the outside world, she appeared as the embodiment of royal grace and composure, unaffected by the scandal that was slowly bubbling to the surface. However, for those who were paying close attention, there were subtle signs that suggested all was not as it appeared. The experienced royal correspondents, those who had spent years covering the palace and its inner workings, noticed something unusual. As Camilla interacted with the public and smiled for the cameras, her eyes betrayed a level of calculation and focus. She observed the crowd with the precision of a strategist, her gaze shifting from one person to the next as though she were weighing her options in a game of chess. One of the most notable observations was the bracelet that Camilla wore on her wrist. It was a striking piece of jewelry, featuring a large, dazzling emerald, and it stood out for several reasons. First, it was a piece that had never been seen before in her public appearances. Camilla had always kept her jewelry collection relatively modest, preferring understated pieces that aligned with royal expectations. But this bracelet, with its bold emerald centerpiece, seemed out of place. The emerald in the bracelet resembled the one that had adorned the missing Welsh gold ring, both in shape and color. This detail, while seemingly trivial at the time, would later prove to be a critical piece of the puzzle. At the same time, inside Buckingham Palace, the investigation into the missing ring was hitting several dead ends. Despite the palace's best efforts to track down the missing item, there was no sign of the ring, and the evidence seemed to be leading nowhere. However, the most crucial breakthrough in the case came from an unlikely source, a long-serving servant named Mr. James, who had been a part of the royal household for more than 3 decades. His appearance in the investigation was pivotal, as he had noticed something subtle, yet telling. Mr. James had been tasked with overseeing the security measures in place at the palace, and while conducting a routine check of the king's private study, he noticed something peculiar. The mechanism securing the study's private entrance had been tampered with. There were fresh scratches on the lock, marks that suggested professional tools had been used to gain access. This was not a case of a careless mistake or an accidental unlocking. Whoever had entered the king's private study had done so deliberately, and with the intention of accessing something specific. The significance of this discovery was not lost on the king. The fact that someone had used professional-grade tools to break into the king's study, combined with the missing ring, pointed to an unsettling possibility. The theft had been meticulously planned. The idea of an external thief breaching the palace's security seemed far-fetched, given the strict protocols in place. More likely, the culprit was someone with intimate knowledge of the palace's layout, someone who had access to the king's personal quarters, and, crucially, to the Welsh gold ring. King Charles, now deeply troubled by the mounting evidence, ordered a thorough investigation into the matter. Security camera footage from around the time of the disappearance was reviewed, but there was a significant complication. The palace's sophisticated CCTV system had malfunctioned during the critical window of time when the ring went missing. This lapse in the security system, which had been functioning flawlessly for over a year, could not have been coincidental. The 2-hour period during which the cameras failed was the exact time frame when the Welsh gold ring was taken. The malfunctioning security system, combined with the discovery of the tampered lock, led to a growing suspicion that the thief had inside knowledge of the palace's security systems. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that was troubling. the behavior of one of Camilla's close aides, a woman who had regular access to the king's private study for scheduling purposes, also raised red flags. This assistant had been seen leaving the palace in the early hours of the morning after the ring went missing, carrying a small, tightly sealed piece of luggage. The combination of these factors, the tampered lock, the malfunctioning CCTV cameras, the missing assistant, and Camilla's unusual bracelet, began to paint a troubling picture. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, and the person at the center of it all seemed to be none other than Camilla herself. King Charles, who had long trusted Camilla, now found himself questioning her loyalty and intentions. The evidence, though circumstantial, was growing too compelling to ignore. The bracelet, with its striking resemblance to the missing emerald, was a particularly damning detail. It seemed more and more likely that Camilla had not only taken the ring, but had also tried to cover her tracks by manipulating the situation to her advantage. The once solid foundation of their relationship had begun to crack, and King Charles was left grappling with the painful realization that the woman he had once trusted implicitly might now be the one responsible for betraying him in the most profound way. In the end, the investigation into the missing Welsh gold ring was not just about a stolen piece of jewelry. It was about a breakdown in trust, the unraveling of a marriage, and the growing sense of betrayal that had taken root at the heart of the British monarchy. The theft of the ring, it seemed, was merely the catalyst for a much deeper crisis, one that would ultimately change the course of the royal family's future. As the investigation progressed, it was becoming increasingly clear that the fallout from this scandal would be far-reaching. The question now was not just about the fate of the ring, but about the very stability of the monarchy itself. Could it survive this internal betrayal? Would the king be able to restore his faith in those closest to him? Or would this scandal lead to a permanent fracture within the royal family? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: the monarchy was facing its most significant challenge in years, and the repercussions of this crisis would be felt for generations to come. As King Charles faced the unsettling reality of betrayal within his own household, the situation continued to escalate. The discovery of the tampered lock, the missing Welsh gold ring, and the suspicious behavior of Camilla's aides had shattered the illusion of peace within Buckingham Palace. But the most telling signs of the unfolding crisis came not from the investigation itself, but from the subtle and deliberate actions taken by Camilla, which suggested her ambitions extended far beyond her previous role as Queen Consort. The situation came to a head when Charles noticed a change in the royal website's official biography of Camilla. The alteration was subtle yet profound. Her title, which had always been Queen Consort, was quietly changed to simply Queen. This modification was not just a minor update. It was an overt sign of Camilla's desire to rewrite her own position within the royal family. And more importantly, her challenge to the carefully defined boundaries established by the late Queen Elizabeth II. The title Queen Consort had been given to Camilla in deference to Queen Elizabeth's wishes, ensuring that Camilla's role was seen as secondary to that of her husband, King Charles. This was an attempt to reconcile public opinion, which had been heavily influenced by the memory of Princess Diana. Elizabeth had made it clear that Camilla would never be formally recognized as queen in the eyes of the public, as the position was traditionally reserved for the reigning monarch's spouse. Instead, Camilla's role was relegated to that of Queen Consort, a designation that carried no constitutional power, but was still significant in terms of status within the royal family. The change in title was not only an affront to the late Queen Elizabeth's wishes, but it also marked the beginning of a more aggressive stance by Camilla. Charles was furious when he discovered the modification. He saw it as a direct challenge to the authority he had inherited from his mother, and a blatant attempt by Camilla to assert herself as the true matriarch of the royal family. For Charles, this was a deeply personal betrayal. It wasn't just a matter of tradition or protocol. It was an attack on everything his mother had worked to establish during her reign, and it undermined the stability of the monarchy that had been so carefully constructed over decades. At a meeting with his advisors, Charles voiced his anger and frustration. His voice cracked as he expressed his dismay over Camilla's actions, accusing her of overstepping her bounds and disregarding his mother's wishes. The alteration of the title was, in his mind, a symbolic act that represented the breakdown of their relationship. It was clear that Camilla was no longer content to remain in the background, as she had for so many years. She was now positioning herself as a rival, seeking to carve out a place for herself within the royal hierarchy. This marked the beginning of a deeper rift between Charles and Camilla, one that went far beyond the theft of the Welsh gold ring. For Charles, the ring had always been a deeply personal and symbolic item, passed down through the generations, representing the continuity of the monarchy. The theft of the ring had shattered his sense of trust, but it was the subsequent actions of Camilla that pushed him to the breaking point. Her manipulation of the royal narrative, her attempts to redefine her own title, and her bold assertion of authority all pointed to a woman who was no longer willing to play a secondary role in the royal family. She was determined to control her own destiny, even if it meant clashing with her husband, the king. Meanwhile, the investigation into the missing ring continued, albeit with little progress. As the palace grappled with the internal crisis, Charles found himself isolated, unable to turn to those closest to him for answers. His once loyal aide, Edward, had become increasingly outspoken in his concerns about Camilla's intentions. Edward had been one of the few people who had stood by Charles during his most difficult moments, offering advice and support. But in recent weeks, he had grown increasingly concerned about the direction Camilla was taking. He warned Charles that she was not simply overstepping her boundaries. She was actively seeking to consolidate power within the palace. Edward's suspicions were not unfounded. Camilla's actions, from the change in title to her increasing control over royal engagements and her growing influence over the media, pointed to a deliberate strategy to increase her own standing within the monarchy. Edward's warnings, however, fell on deaf ears. Charles, who had always been fiercely protective of Camilla, refused to believe that she was capable of undermining him in such a profound way. His emotions were clouded by years of personal sacrifice and the ongoing tension in their marriage. He had fought so hard to ensure that Camilla was accepted by the public, and he had sacrificed much of his own public image to protect her from criticism. The idea that she might be plotting against him was inconceivable, but the evidence continued to mount, and the situation became increasingly difficult to ignore. It wasn't long before Charles was faced with a painful reality. His marriage to Camilla had deteriorated beyond repair. The trust that had once bound them together was gone, replaced by a toxic mixture of ambition, betrayal, and insecurity. The monarchy, which had always been a symbol of continuity and stability, was now at risk of being torn apart by internal strife. Charles was left grappling with the consequences of his own decisions that had placed the future of the royal family in jeopardy. Despite the mounting evidence against her, Camilla continued to present herself as the dutiful consort, attending public engagements and carrying out her royal duties. She remained poised and composed in the public eye, but behind closed doors, her relationship with Charles was unraveling. She was no longer content to be a supporting player in the royal drama. She wanted to be at the center of it. Her actions, from the title change to her manipulation of the royal narrative, were designed to send a message. She was not just the king's wife, but a force to be reckoned with in her own right. The cracks in their marriage became more apparent with each passing day. As the tension between Charles and Camilla grew, so too did the sense of unease among the royal staff. Those who had long served the monarchy found themselves caught in the middle of a bitter power struggle, torn between their loyalty to the king and their desire to protect the institution they had dedicated their lives to. In the midst of this turmoil, a sense of uncertainty hung over Buckingham Palace. The monarchy was facing its most significant crisis in decades, and the outcome was far from certain. For Camilla, the theft of the Welsh gold ring had been more than just an opportunity to assert her power. It had been a symbol of her desire to break free from the constraints that had been placed on her for so long. The ring, with its deep connection to the monarchy's legacy, had been a tangible representation of Charles's duty to his family and the nation. By taking it, Camilla had made a bold statement. She was no longer willing to be constrained by tradition or the expectations of others. She was ready to chart her own course, even if it meant sacrificing the very institution that had once given her a sense of purpose and belonging. The situation within Buckingham Palace, now a microcosm of turmoil, reached its climax on the evening of July 25, 2025, when Queen Camilla made an unexpected, unapproved appearance on ITV. This act was a direct violation of royal etiquette and traditions, which typically required such public engagements to be arranged through formal channels. Her appearance was not only unprecedented, but a clear indicator of her growing desire to assert herself and redefine her role within the royal family. On the evening of the broadcast, Camilla sat comfortably in a meticulously arranged studio, her posture perfect, her attire sophisticated. To the audience, she seemed the epitome of grace, composure, and authority. However, those close to the monarchy saw it as a calculated move, one that placed her at the forefront of the royal narrative, a message to both the public and the palace that she was no longer just the king's consort, but a leader in her own right. The content of her interview was revealing. Camilla spoke eloquently about her vision for a modernized monarchy, one that would shift away from the weight of traditional symbols and embrace new values. She argued that the monarchy needed to evolve, focusing on service, connection, and relevance to the younger generation. She criticized the fixation on relics like the Welsh gold ring, which had become the focus of much of the royal family's recent turmoil. In her view, these symbols of royal lineage were archaic and should not define the future of the British monarchy. To an uninformed public, Camilla's statements may have seemed progressive, even forward-thinking. However, for Charles, watching from the confines of his study, it was a direct challenge to the core of his being, to everything he had fought for. Camilla's words, dismissing the importance of the ring and the legacy it represented, were seen by Charles as a declaration of war. The Welsh gold ring had been more than just an heirloom. It was a symbol of his mother's reign, of continuity and stability. The ring's loss had already shaken him to his core, but Camilla's public dismissal of its significance felt like the final blow. The media quickly seized on the interview, framing it as a bold statement of independence from the Queen Consort. Headlines around the world questioned whether Camilla was attempting to undermine her husband's authority, and whether her ambitions were now at odds with the very institution she had once been part of. The media frenzy was relentless, and it wasn't long before public opinion began to shift. The public's perception of Camilla, once shaped by years of scandal and public scrutiny, was now further complicated by her apparent defiance of the monarchy's traditions. Charles, sitting alone in his study, couldn't escape the ramifications of the interview. The images of Camilla, poised and composed, had ignited a fire within him. It was no longer just about the missing ring or the changes to her title. It was about the collapse of their relationship and the disintegration of the monarchy itself. The questions that had been swirling in his mind, about loyalty, trust, and the future of the royal family, were now at the forefront of his thoughts. Camilla's actions were a stark reminder that the personal and the political were inextricably linked within the monarchy. Her public statement, while positioned as a call for modernization, felt like a deliberate effort to undermine his authority and question his vision for the monarchy. As Charles grappled with the weight of the situation, another event unfolded that would bring the crisis to a head. On that very same evening, a security officer discovered a small, gleaming object in the royal gardens. It was a fragment of the emerald stone that had once been part of the Welsh gold ring. The discovery was both literal and symbolic. The fragment, lying abandoned in the grass under the moonlight, was a stark reminder of the damage Camilla had caused, not only to the ring, but to the very fabric of the royal family. The king's heart raced as he realized the significance of the find. The emerald fragment, with its perfect cut and unmistakable color, was a clear match for the ring. Camilla's earlier statement about the importance of moving beyond such symbols now felt like an insult. The discovery of the fragment was a turning point for Charles. It solidified his suspicions and transformed the painful truth into undeniable certainty. The woman he had once adored, the woman he had risked so much for, had betrayed him. She had taken not only the Welsh gold ring, but had also stolen something far more precious: the trust and loyalty that had once defined their marriage. The fragment in his hand was not just a piece of jewelry. It was a testament to the fracturing of his world, to the collapse of everything he had worked for and believed in. Charles, now consumed by the weight of this realization, sought closure. He couldn't shake the image of Camilla's dismissive attitude toward the ring, her refusal to acknowledge its significance, and her attempt to redefine herself as more than just the king's consort. The interview, the fragment, and her continued disregard for the monarchy's traditions had pushed him to the brink. He knew that something had to be done, but the pain of confronting his wife, of acknowledging the betrayal, was almost unbearable. The following day, Camilla entered Buckingham Palace once more, her steps measured and deliberate. She had removed the emerald bracelet that had once adorned her wrist, a sign that she was no longer flaunting the connection to the ring that had caused so much turmoil. Her demeanor was calm, composed, and seemingly unfazed by the events of the previous day. She proceeded directly to the mirror room, a place of reflection and contemplation for both her and Charles. Charles was already there, waiting for her. He had spent the night in agony, reflecting on everything that had transpired. His thoughts were consumed by the idea that his entire life, his reign, his relationship with Camilla, and the monarchy itself, had been irreparably damaged by a single act of betrayal. The image of the shattered ring, the fragment now resting in his hand, was a painful reminder of how fragile his world had become. The room, with its grand mirrors reflecting infinite versions of the king, seemed to amplify his sense of isolation and despair. When Camilla entered the room, she was unfazed. She had long known that a confrontation with Charles was inevitable. The tension between them had been building for months, but now it had reached its breaking point. Charles, standing before her, his face pale and drawn, could no longer contain his fury. With trembling hands, he held up the emerald fragment, its sharp edges glinting in the light. His voice broke as he accused her of stealing the ring and destroying everything he held dear. Camilla, however, was unflinching. She didn't flinch or show any sign of remorse. Instead, she opened her bag and, with deliberate slowness, removed the Welsh gold ring from within. It was damaged, its emerald cracked in the exact spot where the fragment had been found. To Charles, the sight of the ring was almost too much to bear. It was not just a symbol of their marriage or his family's legacy. It was the embodiment of his love, trust, and the foundation of everything he had worked for. And now, it was broken, just like everything else. With a cold, detached tone, Camilla explained her actions. She claimed that she had merely borrowed the ring, taking it as a way of asserting her place within the royal family. For her, the ring was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of her desire for recognition and power. She had suffered under the shadow of Diana and Elizabeth for too long, she claimed, and this was her way of asserting her right to be seen as an equal. The ring, with its centuries-old connection to the monarchy, had become her weapon in a battle for control. Charles, his voice barely a whisper, could hardly process her words. The woman he had loved, the woman he had fought to protect, was now standing before him, unapologetic and unrepentant. The betrayal was so profound that it left him feeling hollow, as if the very foundation of his identity had been ripped away. He had trusted her, and now that trust had been shattered beyond repair. As the confrontation ended, Camilla turned and walked away, leaving Charles to grapple with the devastating consequences of her actions. The monarch, once a symbol of unity and strength, now stood alone, his world in pieces around him. The monarchy, too, was left to face the fallout from the events that had unfolded within the palace walls. The scandal that had begun with the theft of the Welsh gold ring had now become a full-blown crisis, one that threatened to dismantle the very institution it had sought to protect. In the aftermath, the public's reaction was swift and intense. Opinion polls showed a dramatic decline in Camilla's popularity, with many seeing her as a threat to the monarchy's stability. The hashtag #HackAJusticeForDiana trended, a digital reminder of the unresolved trauma that had plagued the royal family for decades. The monarchy, once a symbol of continuity and strength, now found itself on the brink of collapse, its foundation shaken by ambition, betrayal, and the cold ambition of a woman determined to carve out her own legacy.